Hey everyone, it's your co host, Autumn. Before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to share something with y'all. In the first half of this episode, Kelsey, Wes, and I discussed some of the basics regarding medications for mental illnesses and mood disorders. But about halfway through, you might notice that I'm no longer a part of the discussion. That's because I unexpectedly had a panic attack in the middle of the episode and I had to step away from recording. I really wanted to take a quick moment to just share this with you all for two reasons. One, so there wouldn't be any confusion as to why I'm talking in the first half of the episode, but not the second. And two, because we truly want to be people that embrace authenticity, vulnerability, and community. Neither myself nor Kelsey or Wes are experts that have somehow mastered mental wellness or emotional regulation. We're humans on a beautiful and messy journey, just like you. And I'm so grateful to be a part of the Embrace community and want to say thank you to Kelsey and to Wes and to all of our listeners out there for making this podcast and this community a safe space to be a work in progress. And so, with all of that being said, I love y'all and I hope y'all enjoy the episode. Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to the Embrace Mental Health Podcast,
where we embrace a not-so-clinical approach
to conversations surrounding all things mental health. Hello and happy Mental Health Monday, everybody. Welcome to the Embrace Mental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Kelsey, and today we've got both hosts or co-hosts with me. So we've got Wes. Say hi, Wes.
Hi, Wes.
And Autumn.
Hello.
All right, so today's topic is a little bit of a loaded one, and one that, as we've been talking before starting recording here, that we're all just a little bit intimidated talking about. But so we're talking about medication, but before we get to that, of course, we have our opening question. So I believe Wes is going to start us out with that. So take it away.
That's right.
Hi, Wes.
All right. Well, we are right around the holiday Thanksgiving, and so we wanted to ask a festive seasonal question, but something just a little bit off the beaten path. So it has to do with gratitude, but it has to do with gratitude toward others and things that we can appreciate about ourselves, because both are very important. So the question is, for all of us here, what is the kindest thing someone has said to you recently? So I can go first. And what came to mind for me was just one example of, as I practice therapy, a lot of times I know that what I'm doing is helping someone, but there's no feedback from them about that. I just have to kind of read it on their face or make assumptions or see the difference that is made in their lives as the weeks go by. But when I get that positive feedback from clients, it just means the world to me, because it makes me feel good to help other people, and especially whoever that specific person is. I often get a little bit teary-eyed when people pay me those kinds of compliments, just because it's so meaningful to me that they would take the time to do that. So recently, for instance, one time last week, one of my clients, I just sort of reflected something that I was seeing that she was not saying, but it was kind of painted as a picture in front of me. And she just kind of stared at me and said, "You really hit the nail on the head," and said, "That's exactly what I'm going through." And that just felt so good to be able to reflect that back to her in a way that was helpful to her. So, but that just kind of represents just in general, whenever clients give me some positive feedback. Good for my ego.
That's awesome.
All right. I have a question actually a question within this question. I know Autumn and I are both words of affirmation people. Would you say that's one of your top love languages too, Wes, or?
I would not, actually.
Okay.
No. Yeah, it is meaningful to me. I would say the only out of those kind of five popular love languages, the only one that doesn't mean a whole lot to me necessarily is gifts. Obviously, I appreciate gifts. It's nice to get free stuff. It's nice to have somebody think of me, but when when they do, it's not like, oh, that means the world to me, or I'm not great at expressing love in that way either. But yeah, words of affirmation is probably kind of average for me. For me, it's all about quality time and with some relationships, physical touch.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I can go second. So I turned 27 recently, and I had a huge sleepover with a bunch of my girlfriends. And one of the things that my friends organized was we sat in a coffee shop, and probably for about an hour straight, they just said really nice things about me. And like Kelsey said, words of affirmation is my love language. And so I was floating. I was levitating on cloud nine. I was just so, it was just really life giving. And so I have two things actually that were said to me. Like, honestly, this is a hard question for me to answer because I have so many things, not just from that day, but because I just have the best community in the world that consistently encourages me. The two of the things that are coming to mind right now, one of them, my friend Jess said, autumn feels like home. And I appreciate that so much because that's what I try to cultivate. She was explaining how people can just be themselves and they feel comfortable around me. And that is exactly everything that I want to embody. And so to hear that that's actually, being felt and experienced, oh my gosh, I cried. But it doesn't really take a whole lot for me to cry these days. So, and then the second thing is my friend Kyla, she said to know autumn is to know community. And she was just talking about how I have this amazing community of people around me. And once you are like grafted into my life, the people around me kind of bring you into this fold. And it was both super encouraging because I think I have the best community in the world, but I'm biased. And so for someone else to be able to like see that is really beautiful. But then to know that the people that I surround myself with are so welcoming also, that someone who may not really know community well, may not have a lot of friends, they can literally become friends with me. And all of a sudden they have this like entire flock that just loves them and wants to be around them and wants to get to know them and hear their story and celebrate them. And so I cried with that one too. And yeah, I probably could give a whole laundry list of things, but those are
You
the
have
two
lots of
that come to
material
mind. I do.
to
I
work with
really
today.
do. I'm
Yeah.
very lucky.
It's impressive you could narrow it down to two after all that.
Truly.
Yep. All right. Well, I can go. So this I was we were kind of discussing this question before, and it's going to sound a little bit like a shameless plug, which I'm really not trying to do. But I had a couple of people approach me this week about just how beneficial the podcast has been for them, and I had a couple people specifically reach out about my story. And two of the things that really stuck out to me, I had a couple of people who just told me that they were so proud of me. And I don't know, like something about people being proud of you is just, it's such a unique compliment. I don't know how to describe it, but I think it's not something that I often feel like I'm aiming for. I'm not aiming to do all the things in my life so that people will be proud of me. I know some people have that in their lives, and that's not really a top aim of mine. But I think to have somebody express to me that they are proud of me, specifically within my story and specifically in the ways that they've seen me grow in my mental health, and to see how it's been helpful for people, like that's just, it was a really cool thing to hear, that, because like when I look back and when I was in those places, I just never thought there was going to be anything to be proud of from those moments, from those days. And so to see it kind of come full circle a little bit and have people, and somebody else talked about the good mix of compassion, but also conviction. And I think I really like knowing that I kind of hit those two lines because, both of those things together, they can be really, really powerful. Even separate, they can be powerful, but especially when you can mix them together, I think that can be a beautiful mix. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
That's
So
awesome.
I just want to say that the theme with all of ours, and this is something that we and our listeners can apply to our lives if we want to make somebody feel really appreciated, is to identify something that is important to someone. For instance, in my case, and this is true for all three of us here with our examples, but for me, it was knowing that I'm helping my clients and making a difference in their lives. That's important to me. And so
Mm-hmm.
hearing that validated, like you are accomplishing your mission, just feels so good. And I noticed that with Autumn and with Kelsey as well. You've got your community, your hominess, your work on the podcast, your work in your life. So anyway, that's just kind of a fun takeaway from this, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Kindness is also super powerful. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Here, we'll just give a challenge to begin with here. Everybody who's listening, find one person to say something kind to today.
I need
Amen.
more of that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so now on to this loaded topic of medication. And I think we're going to have a little bit of kind of almost two segments to this. The first segment is going to be a little bit more technical and kind of breaking down medication and what it looks like, how it works, and some of those things. And then the second half of it is going to be a little bit more of people's hangups about medication.
Yeah. If you don't mind me saying before we get going, this is a topic and an episode that I wanted to be involved in, but that as Kelsey said, is true for all three of us. I'm a little bit intimidated by it, a little bit even insecure about it, because as those who've listened to this podcast before know, I run a private practice. I'm a therapist by my trade, but I am not, my knowledge base for medication is not as high as I would like it to be. It's probably gone down a little bit since grad school, let me put it that way, because the roles that I've been in for most of my career since then have had very little to do with medication, and I haven't had very much requirement that I do know about it. So it's like anything, you lose practice and you need to brush up on it. But I guess I just want to put that out there because I'm sure that I'm not alone. I'm sure that there are a lot of therapists, mental health professionals out there, maybe even some of you listeners work with, who are not total experts on medication. I sometimes have people sign up to work with me hoping that I can prescribe them medication, and I can't. You need to be a physician. You need to have a medical degree, either being a doctor or a psychiatrist, to be able to prescribe medication. And so, but it would be good for me to be more familiar with it. Mostly I wanted to share that to say that if anybody out there is uncomfortable with this, or if you hear all this information and you're just like, your eyes are glossing over, like, is it really important for me to know all of this? Not necessarily. Think about how it applies to you in your life. So that's all.
Yeah. I think the overall goal of this episode is to help people just to better understand medication and to hopefully take some of the stigmas off of it. I think for some people, what it takes to get that is to understand the technical side of it a little bit, and some people could care less about that. And other people need to have a little bit more of a emotional understanding, or, break down some of those barriers. And so we're really going to kind of look at both of those contexts, and maybe not everybody is going to care about both parts of this, but I think most people will be curious about at least one or the other. So we're going to do our best. But yeah. So this first section, we're going to get into some more of the technical stuff. I'm going to try my best to explain this without being too technical and boring, but also by not dumbing it down too much or speaking to people like they're children, because nobody likes that either. So, so first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at antidepressants. Antidepressants are often prescribed not just for depression, but also for anxiety. But there's really kind of 2, 3, 4 main types of antidepressants. So how most of them work is that they deal with the neurotransmitters in our brain. And so neurotransmitters are basically these chemical messengers within our brains. They kind of work between the synapses or the neurons or brain cells, and neurotransmitters get pushed out, and then there's this process called reuptake where it gets soaked back into the brain cells. And so the working theory for a lot of antidepressants and how they work is that they block that reuptake process. And so really the three main neurotransmitters that are involved with the different kinds of antidepressants are serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. I think I'm saying that right.
Norepinephrine.
Norepinephrine. That's a mouthful. I had to type it a lot this week too, putting her outline together. So
there's a lot of E's and a lot of P's right there.
Yeah, exactly. But we've talked about some of those before. Obviously, we've talked about serotonin and dopamine, I think, somewhat in our stress and mind-body connection episodes. But each of them have some different functions to them. So basically, serotonin and dopamine are two of the neurotransmitters that just generally make you feel good. Dopamine has more so to do with kind of the pleasure receptors in your brain, and serotonin just has a little bit more of that relaxing and calming kind of effect to it. And then norepinephrine. Do I get a gold star for that?
Oh, yeah.
That's one that makes you feel more alert and awake and active. Now, the kind of interesting thing is that norepinephrine is also released in a stress response, but you can kind of see sometimes with people who are struggling, if you have lower norepinephrine levels, you're just going to feel more tired, more lethargic, less motivated. And so when you have less of that accessible in your brain, then you can see how that could lead to some depression type symptoms. So the most common type of antidepressant that is most commonly prescribed, especially for depression, are SSRIs, which stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And so SSRIs, the most common SSRIs are Prozac, Zoloft, Celexa, Lexapro, Paxil. I feel like those are ones that are either in commercials a lot or they're used in, TV shows or stuff like that too
almost household names. I would say probably most people at least recognize
yes.
at least some of those words,
yes,
which is
exactly.
not true. There's so many medications out there, so that's saying something.
Yeah, exactly. And so the SSRIs specifically block the reuptake of serotonin. That is the one that it uses the most. It's kind of an interesting thing because for a long time the working theory was that people who struggled with depression just must have less serotonin in their brains. And that hasn't really been proven to be true, but the SSRIs do work in increasing serotonin levels in the brain. And one of the things that they figure of how they think it probably works is that sometimes after a time of there being more serotonin in your brain, it's believed to work in part by helping the brain to form new connections between cells. There's a lot that doctors and scientists don't totally understand about antidepressants, but that's one thing that they think is probably a part of it, is that extra serotonin in the brain eventually leads to new connections, and the new connections leads to changes in depression symptoms. The next type that is most common for antidepressants is SNRIs, which is serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. And so, as you can guess from the title, the two neurotransmitters that those ones are more triggered towards is, again, serotonin, but also norepinephrine. Some of the common SNRIs are Cymbalta, Effexor, and Pristiq, and those are also often prescribed for people who struggle with chronic pain, like fibromyalgia, because there's something that works in the synapses and the extra levels of those neurotransmitters that sometimes can help people have some of those increased pain signals decreased over time. Then there is one that it's called atypical. I don't really know why it's called atypical, to be honest, because it sounds like it basically works as the same as SSRIs and SNRIs, but it doesn't really deal as much with the serotonin as it does with dopamine and norepinephrine. Yes, sorry, just want to make sure before I... And that one, it's really just Wellbutrin, and I've heard from multiple people in my personal life that take Wellbutrin, and that has worked well for them. And then, yeah, that's really kind of the main three. The other ones are kind of more old school and aren't prescribed as much, or they're only prescribed if everything else in the kitchen sink hasn't worked. And the older types generally have more side effects. So that more or less covers antidepressants. And then I'm going to move into and try and quickly go through anti-anxiety medications. As I mentioned before, SSRIs and SNRIs are also frequently prescribed for people who struggle with anxiety. And you can kind of see how, extra dopamine and extra serotonin and some of those neurotransmitters can help if you're anxious all the time and you have some of that reaction that we've talked about in previous episodes of more cortisol, or the ones that are engaged with the fight or flight response. You put a little serotonin on that and it might help kind of ease it out a little bit.
Yeah, the idea for both of them, it sounds like, is basically like, we're going to make your brain feel better and happier.
Yes.
that will help with your depression and or your anxiety.
Yes, more of the things that make you feel good. We're going to try and get more of that circulating in your brain, because that, I don't know, that seems sensical to me. A more recent type of prescription that some doctors are going towards is beta blockers, actually. Oftentimes beta blockers, historically have been used more for people who have heart conditions or high blood pressure, or those types of things. But especially with people who are kind of in a acute sense of anxiety, like something that's kind of a sudden onset, and maybe they're going through something really stressful and they're just having a lot of physical reaction, things like shortness of breath or shaking hands or racing heartbeat, those kinds of things. Beta blockers are shown to help reduce those symptoms. Now, the thing that kind of makes it tricky is that it really is just towards the physical symptoms. It doesn't really do a whole lot in terms of emotional symptoms, but it is something that is starting to be a little bit more frequently prescribed for people who struggle with anxiety. Like I said, particularly not generally people who have like generalized anxiety disorder, but people who have a more like acute onset of something, or maybe like a phobic reaction.
And it sounds like it's just addressing it from a different angle. Instead of going right to the neurotransmitters in the brain, it is doing what, and I don't remember, I think that we talked about this in the stress episode, but coming at it from a perspective of, if I can interrupt the physical side of that fight or flight response, then that's going to communicate to the brain that everything's going to be okay and that you're not in danger. So it's kind of like coming at it from different angles.
Yeah. And then another common anti-anxiety medication that is prescribed is called buspirone. And this one's a little bit different than SSRIs and SNRIs. It still deals with serotonin, but it works by trying to mimic serotonin in the brain rather than blocking the reuptake process. But it helps promote a sense of calmness and can also block certain functions of dopamine and helps keep a better balance between serotonin and dopamine. This one is interesting because this one is less likely to cause side effects. And there's also a lot of, I think basically all the other medications that I've discussed so far, if you're on them, you have to taper yourself off of them. You can't just quit them cold turkey because you will have withdrawal symptoms. But buspirone, for whatever reason, is not one, like you can just kind of stop taking it and you're not going to have super bad withdrawal symptoms after it. So it Yeah. That one is
See,
typically, go for it.
sorry, I was going to say, but still, we're not doctors. So if you're hearing this and you're like, oh, I can just stop taking my medication, talk to your doctor if you're
Talk
taking
to your
these
Of
doctor.
course, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. This is education, not advice.
Yes.
Yes.
100%.
Yeah.
Thank you, Wesley. A great
Yeah.
thing to say here. This one is more often useful for generalized anxiety disorders. And so it's almost kind of the opposite of, again, this is me, kind of my understanding. It's almost the opposite of beta blockers, where beta blockers are more, I think, used for like acute onset of anxiety, but doesn't seem to help as much with generalized anxiety. It's kind of the opposite for buspirone, where it's helpful for generalized anxiety, but not as helpful for like the acute onset. And then the final one to kind of discuss is, boy,
Benzodiazepines.
benzos. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I've heard benzos, but that just sounds, a little too street.
Little street, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know what we're talking. If you know
Yep.
what benzos are, then you know that benzodiazepines means benzos.
Yep. And so those are your Xanax, Valium, Klonopin, Ativan, that group of medications. And these ones work by, they just release a lot of GABA in your brain, which stands for gamma amino butyric, some sort of acid.
Aminobutyric acid, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah,
Gamma
thank you.
aminobutyric acid.
Yeah, that one.
I may not be as confident as I would like to with all this medication stuff, but boy, can I pronounce things.
Woo! Thank God we have somebody here who can pronounce things, because it's not me. But GABA is definitely, I'm just going to call it GABA. It has a calming sensation to it and even slows down the central nervous system. And so it causes a very effective tranquilizing effect. But the thing about benzos is, first of all, they are not a type of anti-anxiety that you can take every single day. These are kind of in case of emergency or in onset of panic, or if you know that you're about to go through something triggering, it's kind of that, I don't want to say last resort, because I don't want to put that connotation around it, but this is not something that you take long-term to help you long-term. It's kind of one of those things that when it's starting to get elevated, it helps bring that level down. And the reason that they are not prescribed daily is, first of all, they enter the bloodstream quickly, but they also leave the bloodstream quickly. The other ones build up in your system. This one is in and out fast, which is nice, because if all of a sudden you're feeling panicked, within 30 minutes to an hour, this kicks in. Whereas, if the antidepressants literally take 4 to 6 weeks to even start to kind of notice a difference. And so obviously, if you're in the middle of a panicking situation, you don't have 4 to 6 weeks to work. But on top of that, they can be addictive. And like most addictive substances, the more that you use it, the less effective it becomes, which then means you need more to experience. So there is a level of, I don't want to say danger, but there's a caution. Yeah, risk and caution that goes around benzos, because they are very effective for a short period of time, but they are not really a long-term solution, if that makes sense. So
I just feel like whoever's listening to this, we just need to give like a snapping round of applause to Kelsey for the research that she did for this episode.
Thank you.
We'll put in like a like one of those background noises. We'll insert it right here.
Applause.
Yes,
Right.
applause.
You're amazing.
Oh, thank you. I had to do a lot of research, but yeah. I do feel, I don't know, it was helpful for me to kind of understand these medications a little bit better.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, so looking into some of the causes for perhaps some of there being less of those neurotransmitters available to your brain. Sometimes it's just genetic. Sometimes you just do not win the genetic lottery, and it's, an issue there. Just like many other things can be genetic, this can be a genetic issue. If there's elevated levels of cortisol in your brain, then that will increase serotonin reuptake. And so, we talked about, that's essentially the stress response or prolonged anxiety, or the other piece that gets into this is trauma. If you have experienced trauma or you've experienced, honestly, we'll get into this more when we get to our trauma episode, but there is changes in your brain if you experience trauma as a child. And so some of that can contribute to what level of these neurotransmitters are available to send the right messages in your brain. Even things like sleep deprivation and obesity and chronic pain, those can play an effect, as well as nutritional deficiencies. And so, this is a real thing. And so having this medication available to people to help increase the level of capacity of your brain to pass these neurotransmitters makes a difference for people. It's not just made up and it's not just in your head. While there's still some lack of understanding of exactly how it works, newsflash, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later too, but brains are super complicated. But yes, so that more or less covers kind of the technical side of medication. So hopefully you're still hanging with me here and didn't get too bored, for those of you who don't care about the technical side of stuff. So now I want to kind of talk about some of the common deterrents that people have to using medication. The first one that we're going to talk about is side effects. And this is a very real thing. There are a lot of these medications that do have some negative side effects. For me personally, I think I shared in my story that when I hit my rock bottom and went to the doctor and first started medication, I started on Prozac. And Prozac, I do believe, was something that was helpful for me. Xanax was also helpful for me in that time. But once I kind of got over the hump of it, I was very, very lethargic. I was very tired. The Prozac made me very sleepy. I had a hard time staying awake. I wanted to sleep a lot, and that's a common side effect. I ended up switching to Zoloft for a time, which is, again, another SSRI, and it was better, but I still felt like I was lacking energy compared to what I had before. And then after the Zoloft, I eventually figured out that buspirone was the correct medication for me. So that's what I take now. I don't really experience, frankly, any side effects to it. I remember when I first started taking it, I think for like a month I had a mild headaches. But other than that, like after that first month, I don't have any negative side effects to it. And I do think it really does help me with my anxiety. And I still have a Xanax prescription too. So on those days where things build up and I just need something to take the edge off, I will take a Xanax, and it's wonderful. That sounds more street than I want it to too, but it's very helpful. And so, yeah. But there's also people will complain of tiredness, insomnia, nausea, weight gain, sexual dysfunction, headaches, dry mouth. There are a number of side effects that you can experience. And so I think sometimes it takes, like for me, I had to kind of do a lot of trial and error before I finally found the medication that was correct for me. There are some people that have to kind of decide which is worse, the side effects or my unmedicated depression. And a lot of times your unmedicated depression is worse. But to bring it back to what Autumn says, talk to your doctor. Talk to your doctor. Talk to your doctor. And find a doctor that you trust, who you feel like listens to you. And, start that trial and error process.
And honestly, I just want to say my understanding is that trial and error is in a lot of ways the only way, because every body is different. Every body responds to medication differently. I know this is the case for pain medication for those who have chronic pain.
Yeah.
Yep.
Doctors, from what I've heard in interviews with doctors on this topic, is that they try something and they don't necessarily know how well it will work until they try it. And if it doesn't work, then there's plan B and plan C, sometimes plan D. And that's the case with these different psychotropic medications. Anybody or many people who have tried birth control know this. You know, the birth control affects your body differently than somebody else. And so sometimes you just have to like, well, that throws me off in these ways that are kind of unacceptable. Can we please try something else? Right? Even if I have to pay a little bit out of pocket for it or something. And you know, some people like Tylenol, some people like ibuprofen. So you know, it's and it's not, of course, just about liking it, but how effective is it for you? So no matter what kind of you know, whether you're hearing about this from us, whether you're hearing about it from your doctor, there's probably going to be some trial and error. There's probably going to be a number of weeks of a waiting period to really figure out what's going to work best for you in your situation.
Yeah. And even like I know people in my life who started out on SSRIs and had similar reactions to it as I did, that it made them really sleepy. They tried Wellbutrin, and Wellbutrin is another one that is shown to, for whatever reason, have less side effects. It's less likely to give you side effects. So, you know, the Buspar and the Wellbutrin are often helpful for at least trying to avoid those side effects if that's a concern for you. And I found a thing too that said that the first medication you try, you've got about a 50% chance of it being the one that's helpful for you. And they've tried to figure out, you know, nail down like maybe a DNA test or something like that to help determine which one is most effective. And they haven't been able to figure that out. And so it's just trial and error at this point. And so I think sometimes people will try a medication and they either will try it for 3 days and say it doesn't work when, you know, all these medications, except for the benzos, they take a long time before they build up in your system. They say at least 4 to 6 weeks, and a lot of times it's really months before you really can notice the difference. And I think other times people have tried it and they had side effects on one, and so they just write off all of them. But
I've tried medication. Medication doesn't work for me. That is a very broad statement to make.
And like Wesley said, it's different medications work differently for different people. And they haven't been able to figure out exactly why that is, but it just is. And so, and that's not only a psychotropic thing. That's all, like Wesley said, you know, that's all kinds of different medications that work differently for different people.
And as a side note, I'm sure we'll get more into this in the next episode, but I've heard the same thing about people making broad statements about therapy. I've tried therapy. Therapy doesn't work for me. It's like, well, did you try more than one therapist? Because sometimes commonly it takes 3, 4, sometimes 5, 6 tries to find somebody who's really a great fit for you. And yeah, it's a lot of work, but the investment can be worth it. Same can be true for medication for many out there.
Yes.
Yeah, if I could just I feel like the overarching theme is that a lot of people, if you struggle with, you know, a mental health or a mental disorder or mental illness, the thing that you know that you have to hold on to and continue to press into is that it takes a lot of hard work, right? This is not a quick and easy fix. One of the biggest things that I hear when it comes to medication is medication didn't work for me. From people that have been taking it for, you know, like a week. And we, especially in our day and age when we love instant gratification, that's what we're wired to, you know, expect almost. This is not an area, nothing about the mental health world is instant gratification with the exception of the benzos, which we already talked about, you know, the risk involved with that.
Easy come, easy go. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. And so like, if you're listening to this and you are considering medication or you're like getting weary in the medication process, again, talk to your doctor, but like keep going because it is a really long and lengthy process, but like Wes said, it's worth the investment. You know, you have to ask yourself, how much are you willing to fight for your own health? And I can't answer that question for you, but it is important to think about and just, I guess, remember. And then the other thing that I want to re-echo is finding a doctor that you trust. It took me the longest time to find a doctor that I feel like would actually listen to me. And this isn't a term that I like to use lightly, but I genuinely felt so gaslighted by so many doctors when it came to my mental health. Whether it was, you know, they don't believe me, they think I'm just trying to get medication out of them. They, you know, think that I'm being overly dramatic. And it took for me to end up, I've said this before, I ended up in an inpatient psychiatric unit, for me to be like, okay, I have to figure out something when it comes to my doctors because they're not listening to me and I clearly desperately need help. And so I ended up finding a doctor in the area that I live in. Just, it was by happenstance that I found him on Google. Literally the like best doctor I've ever had, someone who listens to me. He don't expect this of your doctors, but he's like, if I'm ever not in office and you call and you need to talk, like I have already made a note for them to call me and I will come into the office to see you. And it's like someone who just actually cares, someone who actually believes you. And that's just been so empowering in general. That's helped my mental health, just knowing that there is a professional out there who believes me, who sees me, who actually wants to help me, because as people who aren't professionals in this field, we lean on the people who are professionals. And if they're not being helpful, it's so discouraging. So keep trying, keep pressing in when it comes to medication and finding a doctor who just actually cares about you.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I could just say one more thing about this whole idea of patience, one more way of saying it or looking at it is, let's say hypothetically that it takes you an entire year of experimenting with different medicinal approaches to your issue that you're trying to get help with. Okay. And it probably won't take an entire year, but hypothetically, let's say that it does. If it makes a difference for a major difference for the rest of your life, right? You've got to keep the long game in mind.
Yeah.
And again, the same can be true for therapy or other types of ways of improving your life. But like Autumn said very well, we're not used to having to wait for things and to do so much trial and error in so many areas of life. But when it comes to our health, including our mental health, that's really the only way. And so you got to suck it up and be patient. And when you're going through a mental health crisis, that's not how I would say that to you. Suck it up and be patient, right? But just kind of speaking broadly to everyone out there, knowing that I don't know your specific situation, but it is going to take some serious work and patience, and there's no way around it.
Yeah. Yeah. But like you said, if it takes you a year, even 2 years, but you do you make it a priority for that year or that next year. But like Wesley said, if it makes a difference for the rest of your life, it's worth it. Whereas if you and it's easy to get weary within this process. It's really frustrating that it takes so much trial and error to find the correct things for your mental health. It's exhausting. But if you, I don't want to say give up, because I don't, that's a little bit, has too much connotation to it. But if you kind of just become complacent with if you become complacent with the not best situation for you, then it could take you extra years of, the rest of your life could be affected. Whereas if you can make it that priority and find the things that work for you, even if it takes, a couple of years, but it makes a difference for the rest of your life, then it's worth it. So then, on top of side effects and previous experiences with medication, obviously there's all kinds of stigmas around medication. And I was even just trying to think about this personally, because when I was in high school, I didn't believe in medication for almost anybody. I didn't, and after talking with my mom and trying to figure out, I really don't know why. My parents were not anti-medication. There was people in my family who were on medication. I really don't remember hearing explicit messages from my church or my school or those places, those places of influence. But I definitely, if you had asked me in high school, I had some of these stigmas. And then even in college, when I started studying social work, I started to come around to, okay, yep, medication can be helpful for some people, but it still wasn't something that I was considering for myself. Even though I was very much struggling with anxiety, that was something had these beliefs, well, it'll numb my personality, or, some of those stigmas attached to it. It wasn't until I got super desperate that I was like, okay, I guess I'll do medication. But then the craziest thing was when I started medication, all of a sudden I realized all these people that I knew were also on medication, and they weren't people who I thought of as weak or messed up or, whatever all the stigmas that can get attached to people who struggle with mental health, these were some of the strongest, smartest, most capable people that I knew. And I was like, well, if they can take medication, why can't I take medication? And now I'm absolutely an advocate for it. But it was a process of, for me personally, getting through these stigmas. And really what it took was me personally needing medication. But I think it's so important for people to get over these stigmas, not just for your own personal, but for the people in your life who need medication. Because I remember saying things to my friends that I like couldn't regret more than, reinforcing some of these stigmas. So even at that point, when if I didn't need medication, it's still important for me to understand to take away the stigmas from medication, because it's helpful for people.
I just wanted to offer an alternative perspective. And I don't know that it was ever said to me explicitly, but I did get the sense growing up that this is just the way that I was raised, and it's like you don't jump right to medication as the first resort. And so that is kind of my background. And I am probably more on the hesitant side of things compared to the average person out there. I am of the belief that there are many people out there who are over medicated and who have, too many medications to treat the side effects of their other medications. And I think that we've all, run into people in those situations. And so, and Kelsey and Autumn and we're not being shy about the fact that there are significant side effects to consider. And you have to understand that you're putting, just like with food, you're putting something into your body that's going to have an effect on your body and that your body is going to respond to in its own way. And so these things shouldn't be taken lightly at the same time. But I cannot tell you how many people who I've talked to who I have, despite my own kind of, I would say, healthy skepticism of not jumping right to medication as the first resort, in many cases, I've heard so many people who I have sort of, helped counsel into talking to their doctor about taking medication say, I wish I had tried this months ago, right? Yeah. That happens all the time. And I tell them, yep, that happens all the time. And so just take that into consideration, that with medical supervision, you can always get off the medication, but it might change your life. And so it's certainly worth considering if you're having any kind of significant mental health struggle like we're talking about.
Yeah. I think sometimes too that belief that medication will take away my personality. If you're on the wrong medication, it might detract, because when I was on the Prozac and I was tired all the time, there was a piece of me that was missing during that time. But there's also been so many people that I know who I finally feel like I get to see them again when they start taking medication, because a lot of times anxiety and depression will take over your personality. And so if you can get on medication, that sometimes, like, I feel like my medication oftentimes helps me to find that piece of me again, helps get it uncovered under these masks of anxiety, and gets it to a place where I can be myself again. Now, again, that took finding the right medication, that took trial and error, but yeah.
And let me just say, as I said in the intro episode, I've known Kelsey for many years, and she is more Kelsey now than she's ever been before. Yeah. And I think that medication has a very significant part to play in that.
Yeah. So, to break or kind of look at some of the specific stigmas, I think one of them is it's a mental problem, so it should be a mental solution. And as we've talked about, there is such a connection between the mind and the body. And so even though, some of your mental health struggles feel really mental, there's still a biological piece that plays into it. Brain chemistry can play a part, trauma can play a part, but it's a little bit narrow-minded to think that just because it's a mental health problem means that there shouldn't be any sort of physical solution to it. I think we've talked enough about that in previous episodes to say that, nope, mental health is not just a mental problem. It's a whole body problem. And so a whole body
We are
solution.
integrated beings. You can't affect one part without affecting the other parts. Your physical health is going to affect your mental health. And of course, there's the whole field of neuroscience, which says, yeah, these are the same thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but I do think also that it's complicated. It's very complicated, and there's no easy answer when it comes to this. Like, for instance, are you struggling because your neurochemistry is sort of inherently off? Is your neurochemistry off because of trauma that you've been through or because of your circumstances? Is your neurochemistry the cause, or is it the measurable effect? There's all these questions that might be impossible to answer even for any given person, but it's just how, one thing that I do want to emphasize is that research shows consistently that for people struggling with mental health challenges, the most effective approach is a combination of medication and therapy.
Yes.
So I encourage everyone out there to at least consider both.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So to wrap up here, we kind of have two more ideas that we want to cover. One is kind of another one of those stigmas that gets wrapped around it. And the other one is a little bit of more of a myth about medication. So to kind of cover the stigma, I think what a lot of the stigmas boil down to is this belief somewhere that needing medication and having to take a pill every day is just a constant reminder that something is wrong or bad with you. And there's just a lot that is, I think, what I would describe as like a mistaken belief around that understanding of medication. The biggest thing to me is that there's nothing bad about you for being in pain. Other physical pain, there isn't the same connotation around it. Even if you think about like somebody who experienced something physically traumatic, if they had tore their ACL or blew their ankle or something along those lines, like if you're still dealing with pain from that 5-10 years down the road, it's almost sometimes can be like a badge of honor of like, oh yeah, I got hit real hard and it still hurts. But when it comes to the mental health part of it, it's like, oh yeah, I went through something really hard 5-10 years ago and it still hurts. I don't know why there's a difference in mentality of understanding. Not that it should be a badge of honor still. I don't really think either one should be a badge of honor. But for one to be seen as a sign of strength and for one to be seen as a sign of weakness, there's nothing wrong with you for being in pain. And so seeking medication that can be a helpful tool to relieving that pain. And I know, there are some people out there who have stigmas around all medication. Like some people refuse to take Tylenol when they are experiencing physical pain as well. But I don't think it's quite the same level as it is for psychotropic medication. But it's just not the same. There's, I don't know. Do you have anything to add, Wes?
Well, yeah, whether it's medication or therapy or any other type of help, I would encourage you listening to this to, if this is a stigma that you have about medication, to use it as a challenge for yourself, to really question yourself and ask, how am I benefiting from keeping this in the dark, from hiding this from my own sight, from pretending that I'm not having this problem? In what way does that benefit you or the people around you, especially long term? Maybe it benefits people around you short term, but that's not a sustainable approach. So whatever way you're getting help, including medication, I'm of the belief that it's pretty much always better to bring stuff out into the light and deal with it, right? To be honest about our struggles so that we can address them and move through them and maybe actually be the whole and happy person who you feel like right now you're pretending to be.
And even having that mentality and holding it against other people, believing that because somebody else takes a pill that something must be wrong with them. The people closest to you, what they think matters. And so if your belief that somehow being in emotional pain is a sign of weakness, but that's causing somebody to experience more pain, what does that benefit for them or even you within that relationship?
In any area of life, if you're having a problem and somebody is offering you, I don't know if we'd call it a solution, but if somebody is offering you something that will help with your problem, in what way does it make you a strong or superior person to turn down that help? That seems kind of foolish to me in general. And we do live in an age of amazing medicinal help in many areas of life. And obviously, I'm hopeful that in 10 or 20 years, we'll look back on now and see some of our solutions as kind of primitive, the way that things continue to advance. It's a great thing to be hopeful for. But even now, compared to 30 years ago from today, there have been so many advancements that to not take advantage of that, again, just seems kind of foolish to me if that's the only reason that you're not taking advantage of it.
Yeah. And now to bring to our kind of final point, and this one's a little bit different, but I think one of the myths about mental health medication as well is that it should be a cure. And I think that has connotations for both sides of things, where if you start taking a medication and you realize like, oh, I'm still dealing with some symptoms, this pill didn't work, and you throw it away, the reality of mental health medication is that it cannot feel your feelings for you. It can help to relieve symptoms. And, the way that I think it helped work for me was it helped bring those symptoms down a notch. And so I had a greater capability of dealing with it then, where up here was super overwhelming. Medication helped bring it down to a place where it was manageable. And then through through therapy and through putting the work in, then I was able to put it down even farther. Medication is not a cure for mental health. And like Wes mentioned earlier, it's really not recommended that you just do medication alone, because the greatest benefit, the most effective treatment for depression, for anxiety, is the combination of medication and therapy. And so this idea that psychotropic meds should be a cure is not really accurate either. They are limited. They are not, they're not super pills that magically take away all of your problems or unlive trauma that you had in your life before or whatever it is. So understanding that medication is a great tool and it is very helpful, but it is not the end all be all for,
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that everyone who I've ever known who takes medication for mental health struggles is also having a hard time dealing with issues in their present or from their past. And that taking medication gives them the opportunity to actually have a fighting chance against those circumstances, against those problems, to be able to change their ways of thinking, of behaving, of approaching either their present or past challenges. Whereas before they took medication, in many cases, they were simply overwhelmed or they were moving at kind of a snail's pace. Mm-hmm. And again, for a lot of them, taking medication allowed them to actually make significant progress more effectively.
Yeah. So, I don't know, I feel like that pretty much wraps up at least our initial discussion on medication. We might have more discussions in upcoming seasons, but just kind of cover the basics of how it works and trying to kind of talk through some of the common misconceptions around medication. So, before we go, we have our reflection question for you guys. And so the reflection question for today is, in general, what thoughts, beliefs, or reactions do you typically have about personally accepting help for something? It doesn't have to be mental health, but a lot of times people struggle to accept help. And sometimes that can play into some of the reluctance towards trying medication. So it's to kind of think about, what is your typical reaction to either accepting help or even needing help in a situation? And a second kind of follow-up question to that is, where do you think that comes from? So, yeah.
Great questions. So before we go, please, we invite you, before we ask you to follow us, we're going to ask you to email us and send us your thoughts, your questions about this podcast episode, about the podcast in general. And we're going to start addressing some of those emails in upcoming episodes, we hope.
Mm-hmm.
But do also follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/emh.nsc. That's for Embrace Mental Health, Not So Clinical. And on Instagram at embrace.mental.health. And our email address, I should have started with, embracementalhealthnsc@gmail.com. So those are some ways that you can stay connected with us. And on those social media accounts, you can get some, Autumn has put together some fantastic little short videos and clips from our episodes to get some of the highlights and reminders about new episodes. You can get it as soon as we drop it. So lots of benefits to that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, everybody enjoy the rest of this Mental Health Monday, and we will see you next week.
See you in the next one. Bye.